cherishes, that he delights in, that he wants, that he cannot live without her. In all our activity of preaching and missions and study, but is there a restlessness in your heart? Is there ever a sleepless night? If I don't have more of you, I will die. If I don't know you in a greater way, whom do I have but Thee, O God? Isn't it amazing that Moses had somewhat of a large ministry? I don't think that there will be any of us that probably has a ministry the size of Moses. And yet, young man, young woman, thinking about being a missionary, realize this: that after all that God used him for, after all the mighty works that were done through Moses, he soon came to understand that it was not enough. Even with a great and powerful and worldwide ministry, even knowing that hundreds of thousands had been redeemed through his surrender to the Lord, it was not enough for him. And he said this: show me your glory. I must have you. Any man who can be content with ministry has denied the reason for which he was called into the ministry. If any man can be content with mere study and preaching and ministry and missions and all these other things, then it seems to me there's a great deal of idolatry in their life. Augustine was right. We were made for Him. And we will be restless until we rest in Him. There is an intimate communion and fellowship and a walking with God. And that must be our main pursuit. Study your own life. Study it for a moment. Think about your own life. Isn't it much easier for you to sit up with the boys, even when those boys are 60? To sit up with the boys around a table and talk theology all night? Isn't it for the most part easier to do that than it is to tarry in the presence of the Lord alone in prayer all night? Say it is. Isn't it easier to read a good book? Even when it's John Owen saying something in 37,000 pages that he could have said in 2. Isn't it easier on the flesh to stay up all night working through one paragraph than it is to stay up all night with Him? That in itself is evidence that we are not fully and completely redeemed. That there is still a part of us, still something left in us that awaits a redeeming work, a glorification. And isn't that a horrid thing to say about ourselves? I mean, if we were to commit a crime, I would have to say that being able to delight in almost anything other than just tarrying in the presence of God is the worst crime. I have 2 little boys, and they are boys. One is 7, and one is 4. And we live out on 7 acres of copperheads and rattlesnakes. And my boys are the 2 most dangerous creatures out there. The other day, some construction men were working out there, and my little boy ran up to the back of my the back of my blazer, and he pulled out his BB gun and started waving it around. All the construction workers thought it was a .22, and they were just diving behind the building, trying to keep themselves alive. My boy came back 2 nights ago with a stick. God had given him an epiphany. There are 5 dogs that live on the other farm that chase him almost daily. But the other day he walked out with that stick. And when the first dog came at him, by instinct, he swung and smacked that dog right upside his head. And when that dog took off running, my son looked at that stick and he had an epiphany. This stick changes absolutely everything. I have 2 wild boys. They will shoot their BB guns through a window. They will ruin the aluminum siding with their slingshots. But when I walk home, when I come down that path in the evening, those boys can be invested in the most captivating thing for them. But when they see Dad, and they get that look on their face, and they begin to run down that path, all their little crimes throughout the day that has so bothered their mother become so insignificant because of a heart that they have of wanting their Father. I submit to you that David was not the most clean among God's people. He was not the most orderly or tidy with regard to the law of God. He did not dot every I, nor did he cross every T. But no one had a heart like him. You may be as clean and precise and civilized and respectable in your reformed Christian life and not at all be pleasing to God. Now, I am not putting forth antinomianism. I am not saying that we should live like wild men without law. But what I am saying, that in all our doing, the greatest thing is a passion for God. And it is not something that can simply be read and digested. It must be birthed in the heart of a young man and a young woman as they seek passionately after Him. The more they know Him. You say, well, I've studied the omniscience of God. On your knees. Crying out for it to become a reality. I can hear Dr. Piper preach a sermon and it just warmed my heart. I can hear one of his disciples preach the exact same thing word for word, and I know there is no reality in it. Do you know Him enough to honor Him? Is your heart so given? Or would you trade the seeking after God for a good book? Would you trade the seeking after God for a TV or a radio program or this or that? Are you like the doctor's relationship with my wife? He knows so much more about my wife than I do, but I know my wife. These men, they could not give themselves to the work of God. They could not do anything but despise Him. Because their heart was not right. And it was not right because they did not know Him. He goes on and he says in verse 10, "Oh, that there were one of you, one among you, who would shut the gates, that you might not uselessly kindle fire on my altar. I am not pleased with you, says the Lord of hosts, nor will I accept an offering from you." It is not necessarily a bad thing when a church, as we say in America, when a church dies, when they shut the doors to a building. When they have shut the doors to their building, it is just evidence that they died a long time ago, if ever they were alive. Religious activity even the work of missions is nothing in itself.